Something else we can do is pass widgets into traits as well. This you'll do in cases where maybe you have a modal that you reuse and the content of the modal have to be dynamic. So to illustrate this, let's remove the input from the trait and instead have a dynamic component rendering after the input. I'll remove the placeholder since there's no longer an input inside the trait. And now instead what we want to do is pass in, let's call it widgets, that can be called anything, which will be an array. And maybe we want to render another icon inside. So now we have two trait properties we're passing in, icon and widgets. We need to specify that this trait will expect widgets. The type is, let's make this an object. The type is array. And I specify a default value for cases where we don't pass one in. So by default, there'll be nothing inside the widgets array, just an empty array. Now to be able to render this, need to put it somewhere. No, we can't do this, $widgets, because the widgets array expects objects to be inside it. And this is an array. So what we would actually have to do is one of two things. What we could do is build another container and put the widgets value over there. So now inside our container, we have our icon being rendered and another container. And the only purpose of this container is to render the widgets we've passed in. There we see our first icon and our second icon. We can also, of course, pass multiple in. And you see multiple being rendered. A different way we could have done that is to have opted to not render them here, but instead to render them in a different container, for which we would have had to wrap this one in a new container, for example. So there's our old outer component, our outer container. And now we could move this out to there. So it's important to know where you want to place your extra widgets. Very often, like I've mentioned, you'll have your situation with your modal. So your trait will look something like this maybe. You'll have a container, probably with a box shadow on the outside. You'll have a title bar at the top with an icon and a label. You'll maybe have a toolbar at the bottom with a button. And then your inner container over here will be the one in which you plug in your $wgts, which again can be called anything. It's also important to remember where you put your scopes. You can have multiple scopes on a component. So what we could do is we could specify a scope for the trait. My fancy input, whatever we want the scope to be. Relative ID on the icon, for example. So what we could do now if we wanted to change the background color of this one, just make sure it renders. It does. We could, for example, have a script now on this one. Triggers on mount. It's working. Let's just go check our scopes again. We have my fancy input, relative ID icon. on mount. So very likely what's happening is, because this is correct, very likely what's happening is this one isn't mounted yet. So I could do await, which is not good practice, but just for illustration purposes. Then we said that applying, or the better way would just be to give a source to our onMount. Source to the onMount being this one. So when this one mounts, we want to do the set state. It'll work out as well. But with traits, because we know we can override certain things, I'm also able to give a scope to this component, which currently has a scope of my fancy input, and I'll just call it my input. Now I can use the same one I specified over there, or I could use the original one. I need to change both, of course. My input. Or we can use the original one, meaning that in the same way that scripts and flows are combined into an array, scopes will do the same. A component can have multiple scopes, but not multiple relative IDs. How we normally use this is we would have a scope we use in the dashboard. So any component that we want to, or any script that we want to work against this component, we use the scope we've defined. But internally for a component, when you build your trait, you have a scope that you can use. So if I have a flow in my component somewhere, maybe over there I've defined flows and I want to access this component, I can use it's called my internal scope. So even though both scopes are available, you should see it more as a kind of like a open-closed principle where this component is closed, the inner workings of this trait are closed. The only way which you can modify it is by setting trait properties in, meaning that we don't have access to what the scope is. We don't know what the scope is because the person who built this trait might change the scope in the future. We shouldn't rely on it. Instead, if we want to access it, we should give it our own scope on the outside and use that instead.